I think the media coverage has always been incredibly skewed. Uh, Generally, when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, both before and after the 7th of October, I think there generally has been an issue of bias, underreporting, deliberate omissions. Even when things are accurately reported, they often tend not to be sort of headline news. And what's worse is often there's an amnesia of things that the very same outlets have printed in the past that can directly then contradict the kind of biases that they then try to put out. So I think there's always been that sort of systemic issue. It became much more blatant after the 7th of October, and I think it's precisely because of the advent of things like social media, where what was being live streamed just simply didn't match the narrative that was coming out. And I think it's precisely that can largely be credited, I think, for the increased interest in what is happening in the Middle East. The 7th of October was a real turning point. I think it was a real inflection point in world politics. It had a rippling effect everywhere, whether that was in sort of domestic politics of Israel's various allies at the ballot box to the way that the entire international system has now been discredited, right? Having been established to prevent the very kinds of things that we've seen unfold in the last 3 years. And that coupled with the fact that now information isn't just limited to mainstream legacy media anymore. They're not the only sources of information. People can turn to things like social media. And I think, unfortunately, social media is now becoming far more of a reliable source of news coverage than legacy media.
There is, on one side, there is a really professional presentation from the BBC and a very good detailed analysis from the Guardian side, Observer, the Economist and people like that. But there's also the red tops, the tabloids, because don't forget the tabloids industry in the UK is very strong. It always has been. And the tabloids approach is completely different, obviously. But what is really interesting that in the later sort of stages of the Palestinian conflict, Gaza conflict, and Iranian conflict, that even the tabloids were sort of being kind of sympathetic with what was going on in terms of bombing, non-stop bombing, and also all the destruction that was taking place. Now, the other thing that's really interesting for me is that you have a station called Channel 4 News, which is, I would say, exemplary in many ways in its presentation, a much deeper analysis, much deeper debate in 1 hour program. That's one single hour program at 7 o'clock on Channel 4 has been one of the most important ways of understanding how events can be understood and how it can be analyzed in much deeper sense. And that has really set because the difference between Channel 4 1 hour presentation of the news and of course looking at the 6 o'clock news for 35 minutes from the BBC or 10 o'clock news for 35 minutes on the BBC, you see that though the Middle Eastern news is part of their agenda, but it's sort of it is sporadic and episodic. When it is like a huge conflict, like the carpet bombings taking place in Iran, they focus on that, but then at some point it just kind of drops off. Whereas Channel 4 has been continuously focusing on what's going on in the Middle East, what has been going on in the Middle East, but also with the debates and analysis, which is really part of their presentation.
Normally, British media, or rather the BBC, is actually really good at reporting foreign affairs, as opposed to reporting domestic affairs, where it's just terrible. But when it comes to this conflict, unfortunately, the entirety of the British media spectrum, with a couple of exceptions, like perhaps The Guardian, is in fact failing to give the appropriate responsibility to the actors that actually made it. I don't know if you remember this, but I think like 3-4 months ago, an article on the Telegraph, of all sources, actually was written in the way that worded Israel as the one being responsible for the atrocities that were happening. And someone pointed it out on Twitter. I think it was Owen Jones. And after he did that, they actually changed the wording to an impersonal passive tense. So the truth is that there is the awareness of who is actually doing what in the Middle East. But for propaganda purposes, it must be, or rather, maybe not for propaganda, but for editorial choices, if you want to put it more like that, they choose to do this differently. Italian media is doing the same as well. Maybe not the more moderate one, but the right-wing press, such as Libero. The editor of Libero, I think, Mario Secchi, actually went on a talk show and said, yes, we made the editorial choice to be in support of Israel, and we are writing the articles according to that. But he said so very plainly on national television, and without any pretense of embarrassment. So I don't know, maybe that is preferable to what happens with British media, where they get all uppity and offended when their impartiality is put into question, and then they behave in the exact same way.
In the case of Palestine, I think you've seen a concerted effort by mainstream media in the UK to not talk about the conflict in as critical a manner as it deserves. And there have been this so-called neutrality that the BBC, for instance, seeks to promote, doesn't always work in the conflict, because what you have is you have a factual set of events, and you have one side denying those facts. And therefore, what the BBC is finding itself in the position to do, and it's deciding to do, is to give both versions when actually one version is factual. And we don't just see this in Palestine, but we see this in, I don't know, the way that America's reported on nowadays in this sort of post-truth era.